Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The Arizona sky hung low, gray and quiet, as dusk gave way to the kind of night that made men double-lock their doors. Far off in the distance, the last traces of daylight bled into the hills, casting long shadows over the edge of Elias Ward's forgotten land. His small ranch sat silent, just a single lantern flickering in the barn and a tired old horse shifting weight in its stall. Elias had been splitting kindling behind the cabin when he first heard it. Something like a dry branch breaking, then the faint sound of movement, heavy and uneven. He stopped mid-swing, his breath tight. He didn't speak, didn't call out. No neighbors close enough to invite trouble. No sheriff asking him to help in town fights. No ranchers looking for an extra hand. He tended a small herd, kept his tools sharp, and stayed to himself. Tonight, he walked along the narrow stretch of creek that cut past the back of his property. The winter had not yet fully settled, but the air already carried a cold bite. Elias moved with steady caution, scanning for tracks or broken branches. He had learned to trust the land. It always showed signs when something was wrong. He found the sign sooner than he expected. A piece of torn deerskin clung to a low branch, wet and stained. He stopped, studied it, and felt his stomach tighten. It wasn't from an animal. Elias lowered the rifle, but didn't rush. He approached with slow, measured steps, eyes locked on her back to check for movement. His instincts told him she was still alive. Her back rose just enough to catch the breath. He crouched down beside her. "Hey," he said quietly. No answer. "Can you hear me?" Still nothing. He glanced over his shoulder. The barn was closer than the cabin. He made the call. With both arms, he lifted her. She was warm with fever and lighter than she should have been. She tensed slightly as he picked her up, just enough to show she was conscious, but too weak to fight. Elias adjusted his grip and carried her inside the barn, into the tack room where it was dry, warmer, and out of view. He laid her on an old blanket, pulled a water canteen from the hook, and set it beside her. Then he built a small fire in the steel barrel he kept for cold nights and lit a single lantern. The light spilled gently across the woman's face, sharp cheekbones, dark smudges under her eyes, and a long cut along her temple that had dried into a dirty scab. She looked young, maybe 25, maybe less, but something about her made him think she'd lived far more than that. He kept his voice low. "You're safe here. Nobody's going to touch you." She stirred but didn't open her eyes. Her lips moved like she was trying to speak, but no sound came out. Elias Ward, 37, had been living alone on this land for nearly 6 years. He wasn't born in Arizona. He came from the Mississippi hills, the son of a blacksmith, once married, once a father. All of that ended in a wagon ambush that left him under a dead mule with a broken leg and 2 fresh graves to dig. After that, he drifted, fought as a scout in skirmishes that weren't officially wars, worked freight lines, slept rough, and eventually bought this land with cash and silence. He didn't write letters, didn't want to be found. He didn't bring people back to the ranch, ever. Yet here he was, kneeling beside a woman who didn't say her name, didn't explain a damn thing, and didn't need to. She looked like she had nowhere else to go. He touched the back of his hand to her cheek. "Huh." He pulled off his coat, laid it over her, and sat back against the wall. The rifle leaned beside him, close but not in his hands. He stared at the fire. Her breathing was shallow but steady. Every now and then, she twitched, fingers curling slightly, head turning away from the light. He could guess the kind of dream she was having. He'd had them himself for years. A few hours passed. The night deepened. She woke with a sharp breath and lurched upright, gasping, one arm shielding her chest, the other reaching instinctively for a weapon she didn't have. Her eyes locked on Elias, wide, scared, and full of questions. He didn't move. "You're in my barn," he said evenly. "You passed out. I brought you in." She didn't speak. "There's water. You're hurt. You can rest here till you can walk again." Still no answer. But she didn't try to run. He watched her for a moment, then stood slowly and stepped toward the door. "I'll be outside." She blinked, tracking him as he left. Once the door closed behind him, she sat back, knees pulled up to her chest, and listened to his footsteps fade into the dust. He returned an hour later with a clean bandage, a tin of beans, and a look that said he wasn't asking for gratitude. She didn't speak, but she let him clean her wound. Her fingers trembled, but she didn't flinch when he dabbed at the dried blood. Not once. He didn't press her for her name, her story, or why she'd been running barefoot across the desert. That could wait. The mission, for now, was simple. Keep her alive. Let her decide what comes next. And figure out, quietly, what the hell just walked into his life. The morning crept into the barn without warmth, its pale light slipping through the gaps in the wooden walls and settling gently across the blankets where the Apache woman rested. Elias stepped inside with quiet boots, carrying a pot of warm water and a cloth. He had slept badly. Every time he closed his eyes, he half expected to hear her collapse again or wake screaming. But she hadn't. She stayed silent, curled beneath his coat, breathing slow and steady. When he approached, she opened her eyes instantly, alert, guarded, the same way a hunted person wakes. She pushed herself upright with a stiffness that made her wince. Elias paused a few steps away, giving her time to adjust, giving her the space she seemed to need. "You've got a fever," he said plainly. "I can help with that if you'll let me." She didn't answer, but her shoulders eased a fraction. That was enough. He knelt and set the pot beside her, soaking the cloth and wringing it out. As he reached for her forehead, she tensed. Elias froze, waiting. Slowly, she lowered her chin, allowing it. He pressed the cloth lightly to her skin, cooling the heat that clung there. Her breathing steadied. After a moment, she whispered her name. "Ayoka." Elias nodded once. Elias Ward. Their eyes met briefly before she looked away, as if saying her name had cost her more than it should have. She held the blanket close to her shoulders, watching every motion he made, measuring him. Elias could see the exhaustion beneath her caution, the way her fingers trembled, the way the sweat on her skin caught the light, the way she leaned back against the wall only after she was sure he wouldn't reach for her. He kept his voice steady. "You were alone out there, barefoot, clothes torn, someone chasing you." Her jaw tightened. She didn't answer. Instead, she shifted her leg slightly, exposing a deep bruise along her calf, the kind only a hard fall or rough hands could make. Elias didn't push for details. Pressing her now would only make her retreat further. Still, he needed to know enough to keep trouble off his land. "If someone's looking for you, I need to be ready." Ayoka lowered her gaze. Her voice came thin, almost rasped. "I was sent away. By her people." She nodded once, forcing the word out. "Exiled." Elias absorbed that quietly. He understood the weight of a home lost. What he didn't understand, yet, was why she had been sent out alone, injured, and pursued. But she wasn't ready to share that. He could see in the way she held her breath between sentences, as though every memory tightened something inside her chest. He stood and stepped back to give her space. "You can stay here until you can move. I won't ask anything more than that." Her eyes lifted to him again, searching for something. False kindness, hidden motives, a price. She found none. Elias wasn't a man who played roles. He didn't know how. Ayoka's voice shook slightly. "Why help me?" That was the question listeners from Chapter 1 might have wondered as well. Why a man who kept to himself, who didn't trust easily, would carry an Apache woman into his barn without hesitation. Elias answered honestly. "You look like someone who needed help," he said, "and I've seen too many people die alone." The honesty softened something in her expression, even if only for a moment. He turned to leave, giving her room to breathe, but she called out, just one word, quiet and strained. "Wait." Elias stopped. Ayoka shifted uneasily on the blanket. "If I stay, no one else comes here?" "No," Elias replied. "Not unless I want them to." She let out a small breath, almost relief. The fear of outsiders was clear now, something Chapter 1 hinted at but didn't explain. Elias understood. Whoever forced her into the desert wasn't just sending her away. They wanted her out of sight. Maybe worse. He spoke again, voice calm. "You're safe. I won't let anyone in without you knowing first." Ayoka nodded, gripping the blanket as if anchoring herself. Elias spent the next hour checking her injuries. He wrapped the deeper cuts with clean cloth and made a paste from dried herbs he kept in a tin. She watched each step carefully, not because she doubted him anymore, but because she seemed unfamiliar with being cared for. Every time he brushed against her skin, even lightly, she stiffened first, then slowly relaxed. When he finished, she whispered, "Thank you." The words sounded like they hadn't been spoken in a long time. He didn't respond with anything sentimental, just gave a slight nod and stood. "You rest. I'll be outside if you need anything." Before he left, she spoke again. "You live alone?" "6 years now." She studied him for a few seconds. "Why?" Elias hesitated. The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. In Chapter 1, his past was only touched on. Here, he filled the gap without giving too much away too fast. "Because I'm better at being alone than being around people," he said. "And because I've lost enough already." Ayoka didn't push further. She didn't need the details yet. The truth behind his isolation could come later, when trust no longer felt like a risk. Elias stepped outside and closed the barn door gently. Ayoka leaned back against the wall, breathing slowly, trying to understand if this place, this ranch, this man, was a temporary shelter or the first safe ground she'd stood on in years. For now, she stayed. Elias listened from outside, hearing her settle under the blanket, hearing her small sigh of relief, and made a quiet decision he hadn't planned to make. Until she could walk, he would keep watch. Until she trusted him, he wouldn't move his bed back into the house. And until she spoke the rest of her story, he wouldn't ask another question. The fragile truce had begun, and neither of them knew yet how much it would change. The first night, after Ayoka spoke her name, passed in uneasy quiet. Elias settled just outside the tack room, leaning against the barn wall with his hat pulled low, his rifle beside him, and a blanket draped loosely across his legs. He tried to rest, but every half hour he found himself listening for her breathing, checking for movement, waiting for the sound of distress. He told himself he was only being cautious. After all, someone exiled to her condition might have enemies close behind, but the truth was simpler. He didn't want her to panic alone. Inside, Ayoka lay awake far longer than she let on. She stared at the barn rafters, her fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. The warmth of the fire and the quiet around her should have eased her mind, but her body stayed rigid with the familiar sense that rest was dangerous. Her exile was still fresh, and the memory of being driven out. Accusations she never had the chance to answer, hands pushing her away from the fire circle, the threat in their eyes, would not leave her. She kept listening for footsteps from outside, certain someone would come looking for her. The first question listeners might have wondered from the earlier chapters was why she was so terrified of sleep, why she reached for Elias at night. Chapter 3 begins to answer that. Hours passed. The lantern burned low. And then, sometime after midnight, Ayoka jerked upright with a sharp gasp, breath shaking, hands trembling violently. The nightmare left her disoriented. Shadows looked like figures. The sound of the horse shifting in its stall sounded like pursuit. She pressed a hand against her chest, struggling to steady her breathing. Elias was at the door to the tack room before she could call out. His boots stopped just short of crossing the threshold. "You all right?" he asked, voice low, steady. Ayoka tried to answer, but her throat tightened. She shut her eyes, forcing herself to breathe, but it only made the panic worse. Her hands shook hard enough that the blanket slipped from her shoulders. Elias stepped inside, slow and careful, making sure she saw every movement. "I'm not going to touch you unless you say so." She swallowed, eyes darting to him. Her voice came out small, broken. "Stay." He didn't hesitate. He lowered himself to the ground beside the blanket, sitting close enough for her to feel someone near, far enough that she could move away if she needed. He didn't reach for her, didn't put his arm around her. He simply sat, letting his steady presence fill the space. Ayoka leaned toward him on her own, inch by inch, until her shoulder brushed his. She clung to his sleeve, her breath gradually slowing. She didn't explain the nightmare, and Elias didn't ask. The explanation would come later, when she could speak without shaking. When she finally fell asleep again, her head rested against his arm. Elias stayed awake, staring at the fire, thinking about the last time someone had leaned on him for comfort. It had been years, too many to count. By the second night, the pattern had become clear. Ayoka fell asleep quickly. Exhaustion did that, but woke in a panic several times, each time calling his name softly, barely above a whisper. She didn't ask for anything else, just his presence. She needed to know someone else was awake, watching the dark for her, making sure no one dragged her back into the desert. This answered another question listeners might have: why Elias accepted this without complaint. He recognized trauma when he saw it. He knew how losing home, family, and safety could tear a person apart inside. And he saw that Ayoka wasn't clinging out of desire. She was clinging because she had lost every part of her world at once. Each time she woke, Elias moved to her side. Sometimes she gripped his wrist. Sometimes she held onto the edge of his coat. Sometimes she didn't touch him at all, just watched him, trembling, until the panic passed. Elias began to feel the weight of it. His eyes grew rimmed with fatigue, his movements slower during the day. His horse noticed it first. Elias's usual firm, steady grooming became sluggish. He found himself staring at the fence line for long stretches, trying to chase away the tired fog in his mind. Ayoka saw it too. She studied him whenever she thought he wasn't looking, guilt flickering behind her guarded expression. But she couldn't stop her body from reacting the way it did. The moment darkness fell, her breath shortened, her muscles tightened, and sleep became a battlefield she could not win alone. On the third night, the worst panic hit. Ayoka woke with a strangled cry, hands clawing at the blanket, chest heaving. Elias moved instantly, kneeling beside her. She grabbed the front of his shirt with both hands and didn't let go. Her entire body shook, as if she expected someone to drag her away the moment she blinked. Elias spoke softly, the way one would calm a frightened animal. Not gentle in tone, but steady and sure. "You're safe. Look around. No one's here. Just me." Her eyes darted wildly before finally locking on his. Something in his calm expression broke through the panic. She started breathing again, shallow but controlled. Her grip loosened, and she lowered her forehead to his shoulder, not out of affection, but because she couldn't hold herself upright. Elias didn't wrap his arms around her. He didn't pull her close. He simply held steady, allowing her to use him as support until her body stopped shaking. It took a long time. By morning, both of them were worn thin. Elias's eyes were bloodshot. Ayoka's legs shook when she tried to stand. Their unspoken reliance on one another had grown stronger than either expected. But Chapter 3 needed to address something else listeners might question: why Elias keeps helping despite exhaustion, and whether Ayoka trusts him fully yet. As Elias prepared to fetch water, Ayoka finally spoke without being asked. "I'm not used to kindness," she said quietly. "I don't know how to accept it without fear." Elias paused, understanding the truth behind her restless nights. "You don't need to be used to it," he replied. "You just need to stay alive." She looked at him for a long time, long enough to show that the strange, fragile bond between them was no longer a misunderstanding or accidental comfort. It was becoming something real, something chosen in silence. But neither of them said it out loud. Not yet. The nights would continue. The need for safety would continue. And so would the slow, careful unraveling of their guarded lives. The third night left Elias running on little more than instinct. By the fourth morning, the strain showed in every part of him. His shoulders sagged, his eyes were red from broken sleep, and a stiffness in his movements made even simple tasks slow and clumsy. When he stepped out of the barn at dawn, the cold air hit him harder than usual, carrying a faint pressure in his chest that told him he was pushing past his limit. Ayoka watched him quietly from where she sat wrapped in the blanket. She kept her gaze lowered most of the time, but she didn't miss much. Not his unsteady steps, not the way he rubbed his temples, not the rare moment when he pressed a hand to his lower back from sleeping on the hard floor. She held her knees close and said nothing, unsure how to speak the guilt growing inside her. She hadn't meant to depend on him this much, but fear had its own laws, and sleep had become a dangerous place she couldn't enter alone. Elias didn't blame her, but the exhaustion worked its way into his mind. He found himself losing focus when chopping wood, nearly slicing into his hand. He had to stop and breathe, shaking his head to clear the dizziness. He wasn't the kind of man to complain, but he could no longer ignore the toll of waking to her panicked gasps night after night. The chapter needed to address a question listeners might have had from earlier. Why doesn't Elias ask for space? Why doesn't he tell her to stop waking him? The answer began to take shape here. Inside the barn, Ayoka tried to stand but struggled to keep her balance. She braced her hand against the wall, breathing through the pain in her ankle. Elias stepped toward her instinctively, but she raised her hand, signaling she wanted to manage on her own. She didn't want to add more weight to the growing strain she saw in him. "You're not ready to walk far," Elias said. "I can try," she replied softly. "I'm stronger today." Her voice carried both determination and apology. Elias didn't argue. She needed to feel control again. He nodded and stepped back. Ayoka tested her leg with careful steps, each one slow and deliberate. It was painful, but she didn't hide it. Elias noticed the way she gritted her teeth, but said nothing. She needed dignity as much as she needed safety. After a few minutes, her strength failed. She grabbed the door frame to steady herself. Elias stepped forward, hands ready to catch her, but she shook her head. "I'm fine." "You're not," he said, his tone not unkind, just factual. Ayoka lowered herself back onto the blankets. Her shoulders sank with frustration. But beneath the frustration was something else. Fear that she was becoming a burden he'd eventually resent. When Elias returned with fresh water, Ayoka spoke without looking at him. "You don't sleep," she said quietly. "Each night, you sit awake for me." Elias didn't deny it. He poured water into a cup and handed it to her. "You call for me," he answered. "I'm not going to ignore that." She took the cup, but her hands trembled. "I don't want to harm you." "You're not," Elias said, though he knew the truth was more complicated. Her need wasn't harming him, but the sleeplessness was. His body ached, his mind drifted during simple tasks, and he knew another few nights like the last ones might break more than just his routine. He sat down across from her, elbows resting on his knees. "You have nightmares," he said. "Bad ones. They wake you up fighting for air." Ayoka looked away, jaw tense. "I try to control it." "You don't have to. It's not your fault." She glanced at him then, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "You don't know why they sent me away." He held her gaze. "Then tell me." This was another gap in earlier chapters. Listeners didn't know why her own people exiled her. Chapter 4 begins revealing the truth without rushing it. Ayoka ran her thumb along the rim of the cup. There was conflict inside the band. Arguments about land, supplies, leadership. "I spoke against the wrong men. I questioned their choices." Her voice grew tighter. "They blamed me for what happened later. Said I brought trouble. Said I failed the band." Elias listened without blinking. He didn't look satisfied or shocked, just attentive. "They pushed me away during the night," she continued. "I wasn't allowed to defend myself. I wasn't allowed to stay or return." Elias nodded slowly. "They shouldn't have thrown you out." "Not like that." Ayoka exhaled shakily. "You don't know their anger." "I don't need to," he replied. "I know fear when I see it." Something softened in her expression. She looked at him fully now, noticing the dark circles under his eyes, the strain in his jaw, the weight in his shoulders. "You helped me," she whispered. "But it costs you." Elias leaned back against the wall, stretching out his legs with a stiff sigh. "I've been tired before. This is nothing new." But Ayoka understood. Exhaustion wasn't new, but exhaustion for someone else was. He wasn't used to caring for another person. He wasn't ready for the vulnerability that came with it. That night, the fragile pattern continued, but with a slight shift. Ayoka woke again, breath sharp and shallow. Her hand reached out instinctively and stopped halfway. She hesitated, aware of how hard the nights had been on him. Elias heard her anyway. He was already sitting up, rubbing his eyes, pushing himself to his feet. "You need me?" he asked. Ayoka looked torn between need and guilt. "I don't want to make you weaker." Elias stepped inside the tack room and sank down beside her with a tired sigh. "You're not. This isn't your fault." She looked at him, searching for signs of anger, but found none. Only exhaustion held in place by discipline and a strange, quiet empathy. Still, something changed. Instead of gripping his arm tightly, she rested her hand lightly on his sleeve. And instead of leaning all her weight on him, she kept enough distance to show she was trying not to drain him further. Elias noticed the change. His tired eyes softened. She was fighting her fear for his sake, and that meant more than any words she could have spoken. They stayed there in silence. Ayoka breathing steadily, Elias staying awake despite the pull of sleep weighing down on him. But for the first time, the silence wasn't about fear or necessity. It was about understanding. A delicate balance began forming between them. A new kind of trust, mutual, conscious, and fragile. By dawn, Elias was exhausted, but something in his chest felt steadier. Ayoka, for the first time, woke without a scream. She simply opened her eyes and found him still there, fighting sleep but refusing to leave. Chapter 4 closed not with despair, but with the first signs that their bond was shifting, no longer defined by fear alone, but by the difficult, quiet choice to help each other endure. By the time the next night settled over the ranch, Elias looked like a man carrying weeks of sleeplessness rather than days. His movements were slower, his responses delayed, and even his steady breath carried the weight of someone who had passed the point of exhaustion but refused to stop. Ayoka noticed every detail, the twitch in his eyelids, the quiet groan he tried to hide when he bent down, the way his hands trembled when he poured water. She stayed quiet most of the evening, speaking only when necessary. The guilt pressed down on her. She had not asked for this kind of help, didn't want to drain the strength of the only person who had offered her safety, but her body reacted before her thoughts could. Every time night returned, every time the shadows lengthened, panic rose in her chest until she could hardly breathe. Elias knew it was coming. He watched her shifting uneasily as the lantern light dimmed, watched her hands tighten around the edge of the blanket, watched her shoulders curl inward as though preparing for impact. She wasn't ready to sleep. She feared what sleep brought. The question listeners might have asked by now: what exactly is Elias running from? Why is he so patient? What pain does he recognize in her? Needed to be answered. Chapter 5 begins that reveal. It started just after midnight. Ayoka woke sharply, her breath trapped in her throat. A quiet whimper escaped before she could stop it. Elias was beside her before she even called his name, lowering himself onto the cold dirt floor with a strained breath. "You're all right," he murmured, though his own voice carried the rasp of fatigue. "I'm here." She grabbed his sleeve, fingers shaking violently. "It's the same dream," she whispered, voice cracking. "They chase me. They shout. They say I brought death. They say I deserve to be alone." Elias steadied her breathing with the slow rise of his shoulders. She followed the rhythm without realizing it, matching his pace. When she could speak again, her voice held a quiet plea. "How do you make the past stop?" Elias looked down at his hands. For the first time since she arrived, Ayoka saw something change in his expression. Something raw, something he spent years burying. He rubbed the back of his neck, hesitating, as if deciding whether this was the moment he had been avoiding. He shifted slightly to face her. "You've been asking why I live alone," he said. "Why I keep to myself. Why I don't talk about who I used to be." Ayoka nodded. "Not knowing, it makes me wonder if I can trust you." "And you should know," Elias said, "because you deserve to understand the man who's sitting here every night." He took a long breath, the kind a man takes when digging up something he swore he'd leave buried. "My family was attacked," he began. His voice stayed steady, but his jaw tightened. "Years ago, we were heading west in a small wagon. My wife was sitting beside me. My little boy was sleeping in the back." Ayoka listened, eyes wide, not with judgment, but with the kind of quiet that comes from recognizing someone else's wounds. "It wasn't a battle," Elias continued. "It wasn't a standoff. It was an ambush. A group of men, outlaws, not soldiers, came down the ridge. We never even heard them. They shot the horse first, then the wagon tipped. I don't remember the fall. Just waking under the dead mule with my leg crushed and my family already gone." He swallowed hard, staring at the ground. "I tried to fight. I tried to reach them, but I couldn't move. I lay there until they rode off. And by the time I got free, it was too late." Ayoka's fingers loosened on his sleeve, not in rejection, but in empathy so deep she struggled to find words. "What happened after?" she asked quietly. Elias let out a long breath. "I stopped being a husband, stopped being a father. I wandered, fought for pay, scouted trails for men I didn't trust. Anything to keep moving." He shook his head slightly, until moving became another way of outrunning the truth. Ayoka understood that too well. He continued, voice low, "I came here because it was empty. No neighbors, no memories, no reason to talk to anyone. I thought if I lived quiet enough, the past would stay quiet too." Ayoka's throat tightened, but it didn't. "No," he said softly. "It never does." For a moment they sat without speaking, the lantern flickering beside them, throwing thin lines of light across the dirt. Elias's confession filled the silent space between them. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just painfully real. Ayoka looked at him with new clarity. "You know how it feels," she said. "Losing everything. Being forced into a life you didn't choose." "Yes," Elias replied. "That's why I don't leave you alone at night. Not because you're weak. Because I know what it's like to fear sleep. To fear waking up and remembering what you lost." Her eyes softened, the fear easing into something steadier. She reached out, not desperate this time, not panicked. She placed her hand gently on his. "You don't have to tell me more," she whispered. "But thank you for telling me this." Elias looked at her hand resting on his. He didn't move it away. "I didn't plan to say any of it," he admitted. "But you needed to know who I am. And I needed to stop keeping ghosts to myself." For the first time since she arrived, Ayoka didn't feel like a burden. And Elias didn't feel like a man holding up two worlds alone. The wall between them, built out of fear, exhaustion, and unspoken histories, finally cracked. The atmosphere in the barn shifted. Not into romance, not into ease, but into something honest, something grounded, something neither had allowed themselves to feel in years. Ayoka lay down again, her breath calmer than any night before. She didn't cling to him out of terror. She simply rested close enough to feel he was there. Elias settled beside her, leaning back against the wooden wall. He didn't feel lighter, but he felt understood. For two wounded people who had lived too long in silence, that was more than enough. Chapter 5 closed with the truth laid bare. A confession that did not drive them apart, but instead anchored the bond forming quietly between them. The morning after Elias's confession broke the fragile silence they had been walking around for days. The barn felt different, as if the air itself had shifted. The tension that once clung to Ayoka's movements no longer pulled so tightly at her shoulders, and Elias, though still tired, carried himself with a steadier purpose. For the first time, neither of them woke guarded, waiting for the other to retreat. Ayoka pushed herself upright slowly, testing her ankle. It still hurt, but the swelling had gone down. Elias watched her move with the same quiet scrutiny he'd shown since the night she arrived, but now there was something else in his expression, something that resembled respect rather than simple caution. "You're walking better," Elias said as he filled a small pot with water from the barrel. "Your bandages helped," she replied. He didn't say it out loud, but he'd noticed she hadn't woken screaming that night. She had stirred once, breathing unevenly, but she didn't reach for him in fear. Instead, her hand brushed his arm gently, not desperate, just needing reassurance. Elias had responded by shifting closer without a word. This night marked another gradual answer to something listeners since the beginning might have wondered. When would Ayoka regain her sense of control? When would she stop fearing the simple act of sleeping? Chapter 6 begins showing that shift. They spent the early morning in quiet routine. Elias prepared a small breakfast of cornbread and berries he dried in the fall. Ayoka ate slowly, her gaze drifting around the barn, taking in her surroundings now that she felt safe enough to pay attention to them. "Does anyone come here?" she asked. "Not unless they have business with me," Elias answered. "I don't get visitors." "Why?" "Because I don't encourage them." Ayoka nodded, absorbing that truth. She could see why he lived alone. The ranch reflected a man who avoided unnecessary ties. Tools arranged neatly, supplies stacked with precision, a bunk in the corner of the cabin that looked barely used. Everything in his life existed for function, not comfort. But when she turned her attention to him again, she noticed something else, a kind of weariness that went beyond the sleepless nights. A weariness born from years of solitude. You said you left because of loss, she said. Why come here? Why choose this land? Elias took a moment to answer, as if weighing whether to reveal another piece of himself. Horses do better here, he said. The soil's good for crops, and the land is quiet. No one judges you for living slow. Ayoka listened closely. The question listeners might have wondered, what exactly kept him here for 6 years if his life was filled with pain, was answered through his simple honesty. He wasn't staying out of punishment. He stayed because the quiet gave him room to breathe. And you? Elias asked. Where were you headed before everything happened? Ayoka hesitated. She was not avoiding the truth, merely choosing it carefully. I was trying to find my grandmother's old hunting ground, she said. It is a place far from my band, a place no one watches anymore. I thought I could live there for a short time, just until I knew what to do next. Why there? Because it is the last place where I remember feeling safe. Elias nodded. He understood that desire better than he'd ever admit aloud. Later in the day, Ayoka insisted on helping around the ranch. She stood beside Elias as he fed the horse, leaning on the barn wall when her leg got tired. She asked him how to mend torn saddle straps. He showed her how to scrape dirt from the horseshoes. She watched with focus, absorbing every detail. For the first time, she wasn't frozen in survival mode. She was participating. You don't have to do this, Elias said quietly. I know, she replied, but I want to move again. I don't want to sit with my memories all day. Her answer resolved another silent question. Was Ayoka relying on Elias out of weakness? Or was she choosing to rebuild her strength? Chapter 6 makes it clear it was choice. They spent hours working side by side. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. But even the silence felt lighter. When Ayoka's ankle gave out, Elias moved to steady her without hesitation. She gripped his arm, not in panic this time, but in trust. A steady, calm trust built from the nights he sat with her and the truth he shared without expecting anything in return. You should rest, he said gently. Ayoka shook her head. I can still help. Her determination impressed him, but he saw the strain in her eyes. He placed one hand under her elbow, guiding her to sit. You're trying too hard, he said. I've taken enough from you, she murmured. You haven't taken anything I didn't give freely. She looked up sharply, meeting his eyes. He rarely said things like that. Clear, honest, unguarded. It left a warmth in her chest she didn't know how to explain. As evening settled, they shared dinner outside, near the fire pit. Elias sat with his back against a wooden post, elbows resting on his knees. Ayoka sat a short distance away, close enough to feel his presence, far enough that she could still see the landscape clearly, old habits of vigilance dying slowly. She studied him quietly. Do you miss them every day? She asked. Elias didn't pretend not to understand. Yes, he said, but talking about it, it made something easier. For you? She asked. For both of us. Ayoka lowered her gaze, the flicker of the fire reflecting off her eyes. I've not told anyone what happened the night I was sent away, she said. Not even the parts one understand. Speaking it feels dangerous. You can tell me when you're ready, Elias replied. Or not at all. You decide. Those were the words she needed, permission to choose her own pace. When night came, Ayoka didn't retreat into fear the way she used to. She lay down slowly, still tense from years of instinct, but not trembling. Elias sat beside her, as he always did. But this time she turned to him calm, grateful. Will you stay until I sleep? She asked softly. I will. She took his sleeve in her hand, not with desperation, but with gentle reassurance, as though saying she trusted him, not with her fear, but with her peace. Her breath slowed. Her eyes closed. No nightmare woke her. Elias watched her for a long time, the weight in his chest easing in a way he had not felt in years. He leaned back against the wooden wall, closing his eyes just enough to rest, but not enough to sleep fully. For the first time since she arrived, he believed, quietly, cautiously, that something in both of them was beginning to heal. Chapter 6 ended with something new between them. Not dependency, not desperation, but the early shape of a shared life neither expected to find. The days following their quiet routines brought a calm neither of them fully trusted yet, but both welcomed. Ayoka's ankle strengthened with every sunrise. She could walk without leaning on the barn wall, and she moved with a steadier breath, no longer flinching at every small sound. Elias noticed the change, even if he didn't comment on it. He saw it in the way she sat straighter, asked questions about the land, and watched the horizon without fear tightening her jaw. But the peace that settled between them could not erase one lingering question listeners would naturally ask. If Ayoka was exiled in such a brutal, rushed manner, would someone eventually come looking for her? Would someone challenge the safety she found on Elias's ranch? Chapter 7 answers this. It began late in the morning as Elias repaired the broken fence post along the northern boundary. Ayoka stood beside him, observing how he wedged the new beam into the ground and secured it with thick wire. She asked what kept the animals from wandering too far. Elias explained the natural boundaries, the hills, and the way horses read the land. Their conversation ended abruptly when Elias paused mid-swing of his hammer. His head lifted slightly, listening. Ayoka froze at his sudden stillness, her instincts sharpening. Footsteps, several, moving toward the ranch from the dry ridge. Her breath shortened. Elias lowered his hammer, wiped his hands on his trousers, and picked up his rifle. He didn't aim it, but he held it in a way that made his intention unmistakable. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. Ayoka hesitated. "Is it them?" "I don't know," he answered, "but someone's coming." This moment resolved another lingering uncertainty. Does the outside world know or care that Elias lives alone? And how do the townsfolk view an Apache woman staying under his roof? The answers were walking toward them. 3 men approached across the open land, their spurs catching the dry morning light. They were locals. Elias recognized 2 as ranch hands from town, the third a shopkeeper's nephew. None were dangerous men, but none were harmless either. They stopped a few paces away, each carrying the stiffness of people who came with opinions they were ready to voice. "Elias," the tallest man said, "heard you've got company up here." Ayoka's fingers tightened around the blanket she held over her shoulders. Elias didn't look at her, but he stepped half a foot forward, placing himself between her and the men. "Visitors are rare," Elias said calmly. "So let's get to why you're here." The second man spat into the dirt. "Word in town is you're keeping an Apache woman on your land." Ayoka stiffened. She didn't step back, and she didn't step forward. She stayed still, eyes locked on their faces. Elias didn't flinch. "You heard right." The third man frowned. "That ain't safe. Folks are saying she might be tied to trouble. Bandits, scouts, could bring the wrong people this way." Ayoka kept her face steady, but Elias felt the tension radiating from her. He had predicted this confrontation the moment she recovered enough to stand outside. What he didn't expect was the simmering anger rising in him. Not dangerous, but deeply protective. "She's not tied to trouble," Elias said. "She's recovering from injuries and exhaustion. That's all you need to know." The tallest man shifted uncomfortably. "Elias, people trust you. But bringing someone like her here, alone, makes folks nervous." This addressed another listener question. How much does the town know about Elias? Why do they respect or fear him? The answer unfolded naturally. Elias had a reputation, not of violence, but of reliability. And men like these didn't want conflict with him. Elias's voice remained even. "What happens on my land is my business. She stays as long as she needs." The man frowned. "And if someone comes looking for her, then I'll handle it." The certainty in Elias's tone left no doubt. He wasn't posturing, wasn't trying to intimidate. He simply meant every word. Ayoka felt it too. She watched him, the way he moved nothing but his jaw, the way he kept his rifle low but ready. He wasn't defending her because she was helpless. He was defending her because she deserved safety, and he wasn't letting anyone take it away. "Elias," the shopkeeper's nephew said, "you're risking a lot for her." Elias just shook his head. There's no risk in doing what's right. The men exchanged uneasy glances. None wished to press further. They weren't brave enough or foolish enough to challenge a man who spoke with that kind of conviction. Before turning away, the first man said, "Town's going to talk." "Let them," Elias replied. The men left, boots crunching over dry ground until their figures disappeared over the ridge. When the silence returned, Ayoka stepped closer. Her hands trembled slightly, but not from fear of the men, fear of what her presence cost. "You didn't have to stand between us," she said softly. "Yes, I did," Elias answered. "They don't know you. They see what they want to see." "And what do you see?" she asked. Elias turned to her, his expression steady. "A woman who survived something terrible. Someone who deserves a place to rest." Ayoka lowered her gaze, unsure how to respond. "They fear I will bring trouble." "Trouble comes whether you're here or not," Elias said. "But I won't let it touch you." Her breath hitched, not in panic, but in something like relief she didn't know how to process. Later that evening, as they sat inside the barn preparing dinner, Ayoka finally voiced what had been building in her mind since the confrontation. "My people, some of them might come, not to help me, to finish what they started." She took a slow breath. "Are you ready for that?" Elias stirred the pot of beans and answered without turning. "I don't care who comes." "Why?" "Because you're here," he said simply. Ayoka swallowed, the simplicity of his answer striking deeper than anything else he'd said before. She sat beside him, hands folded in her lap. The fire cast a soft glow on both their faces. "If danger comes," she said, "I won't hide behind you." "I know," Elias replied, "but I'll stand with you." Ayoka looked at him fully now, no hesitation in her gaze. "Why do you trust me so easily?" He met her eyes. "Because I've seen enough people lie. And you don't." The honesty between them settled, like a firm stone in the foundation of something neither had planned, but neither wanted to lose. That night, for the first time since she arrived, Ayoka lay down without trembling. She reached for Elias, not in desperation, but gently, as if acknowledging something unspoken. He sat beside her until she drifted into sleep, watching her breathing even out in the lantern glow. Outside, the world remained uncertain. Danger might still be coming. Her past was not fully behind her, but in the quiet of the barn, their trust had become something stronger than fear. Chapter 7 closed with a promise, unspoken but undeniable. They would face whatever came next together. The days after the confrontation passed with an unfamiliar stillness. The ranch felt safer than it had in weeks, not because danger had vanished, but because Elias and Ayoka now understood where they stood, with themselves and with each other. The tense fear that once lingered in every breath had softened into something steadier, something that felt almost like belonging. Ayoka woke earlier now, the nightmares loosening their grip. She no longer jolted upright, gasping for air. She opened her eyes slowly, grounding herself in the quiet of the barn and in the sound of Elias's boots moving somewhere nearby. Sometimes he returned to the tack room with water before she even asked. Other times she stepped outside and found him repairing the corral or feeding the horse. Glancing over his shoulder with a small tilt of the head that meant you slept well, she always answered with a nod. And for the first time since arriving, the answer wasn't a lie. This chapter needed to address something listeners might still wonder. Would Ayoka heal enough to reclaim her life? Would Elias continue to hold on to the guarded isolation he'd lived in for years? And would either of them admit what was quietly forming between them? Chapter 8 answers these questions slowly, without breaking the grounded tone of their bond. That afternoon, Ayoka followed Elias into the open field where the grass reached her knees. The land stretched wide beneath a pale sky, the air warm enough to ease the stiffness in her ankle. Elias pointed out where he planned to plant corn, how the soil would respond to spring rains, and why the old well still produced clean water. "You know the land well," she said. "I've had to," he replied. "You don't last out here unless you listen to what the ground tells you." She studied him as he walked, a man shaped by solitude, careful and steady, someone who built his life not out of ambition but out of the need to keep going. His confession 2 nights ago still sat between them, not uncomfortably, but like a truth that had finally found its place. Ayoka dipped her hand through the tall grass. When I first came here, I thought I would leave as soon as I could walk. Elias stopped and looked at her, waiting. But the land feels different now, she continued. Safer. Elias's expression didn't change much, but she saw something flicker in his eyes. Hope pushed down before it could show too clearly. You can stay as long as you want, he said. There's room for 2 people to live quiet on this land. She held his gaze. And what do you want, Elias? He hesitated, the question weighing more than she realized. His voice remained low, steady, honest. I want this place to stop feeling empty. Ayoka's breath caught, not from surprise, but from hearing a truth spoken plainly for the first time. Back at the barn, they worked side by side, mending the saddle straps she had learned to stitch. Ayoka's movements were smoother now, her hands steadier. Elias watched her sew with quiet admiration. You're good at this, he said. I learned from my mother, she said. She taught me to repair everything we used. Nothing was wasted. Elias nodded slowly, imagining a past she hadn't yet fully told him. When you're ready, he said, you can tell me the rest of what happened. All of it, or none of it. Your choice. Ayoka finished the last stitch and placed the strap beside her. I will tell you, she said, but not because I owe an answer. Because you've spoken your truth already. Her eyes softened. You gave me back the ground under my feet. Elias swallowed hard, though he tried not to show it. You did that yourself. But Ayoka knew he meant every word. They sat outside at dusk, a light breeze brushing the dry earth. Ayoka watched the horizon while Elias sharpened a small knife, the rhythmic scrape of metal against stone steady and calm. Elias, she said quietly. He paused and looked up. I'm not running anymore. Those words broke one of the last unspoken questions listeners might have had. Would she remain a wanderer, or would she choose a home? Elias set the knife down gently. You're sure? Yes, she replied. The band that cast me out, they will not come for me. They wanted me gone, not found. Any other dangers? I do not fear them like before. She turned toward him fully. You gave me time to breathe, time to stop shaking, time to see myself as more than someone driven out. Elias didn't speak right away. He studied her, taking in the steadiness in her posture, the calm in her voice. She wasn't the frightened woman who had collapsed outside his barn. Not anymore. You don't owe me anything, Elias said, though his voice carried a strain, fear of hoping too much. If you stay, it should be because you want this life, not because you think you have nowhere else to go. Ayoka stepped closer, her shadow crossing his boots. I want to stay, she said, not out of fear, not out of need, because this place feels like it could be mine too. Elias finally breathed, almost relieved. Then stay. Her shoulders lowered, tension dissolving in a way neither had seen before. That night, Ayoka lay down with her back near Elias's knee, no longer clinging from terror, but resting in quiet certainty. She looked up at him as he adjusted the lantern. Will you sit with me tonight? She asked. Of course. This time, she reached for his hand, not in panic, but in gratitude. He didn't pull away. His fingers closed around hers, slow and sure. You don't have to stay awake, she whispered. I know, he said, but I want to. Ayoka's breath softened into the calmest sleep she'd had since arriving. Elias leaned back against the wall, watching her sleep for a moment. Something inside him settled, a weight shifting, a wound closing just enough to let warmth back in. For the first time in years, he imagined a tomorrow he wasn't afraid to face. Chapter 8 closed with the quiet, steady truth of their bond. Not born from desperation anymore, but from choice. A choice to stay, a choice to heal, a choice to build something neither had expected to find. The morning after Ayoka chose to stay felt different from every morning before it. The air seemed clearer, the quiet around the ranch warmer, as if the land itself recognized the shift between them. Elias stepped out of the barn with a calm he hadn't felt in years. Ayoka followed soon after, walking with steady steps, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes focused rather than fearful. The story had one more question to resolve, something listeners might still wonder. Would danger return? Would her band come? Would Elias's past interrupt the fragile peace? Chapter 9 answers these questions fully, bringing the story to a grounded, satisfying close. Elias began the morning by checking the fences again. Ayoko walked beside him, carrying a coil of wire and a small knife. She worked like someone who intended to belong, observing, learning, helping. Her ankle barely bothered her now, the last of her exile fading with each confident step. They replaced the loose post from the day before, Ayoka holding the beam steady while Elias drove the spikes into place. Their movements were synchronized, unforced, shaped by the rhythm they had slowly built together. When I was a child, Ayoka said, quietly as they worked, my grandmother told me a person is strongest when the ground beneath them feels like home. Elias paused, wiping sweat from his brow. Does this land feel like that to you now? Ayoka met his eyes without hesitation. It does. He didn't reply with words, but a faint smile softened his usually guarded expression. She recognized it, a rare, honest sign of contentment that held more meaning than anything he could have spoken. Later that afternoon, they walked into the field to check the soil before planting. As they moved through the tall grass, Ayoka took in the land fully for the first time. The line of the hills, the dark shape of the barn against the sky, the narrow creek reflecting sunlight through the cottonwoods. This place is quiet, she said. Quiet's kept me alive, Elias replied. And now, she asked. He took a slow breath. Now it doesn't feel like too much space for one man. Her lips curved into a small, warm smile. When they returned to the barn, Ayoka finally shared what remained of her story, the part listeners might still have questioned. Why exactly had her people cast her out? What truly happened the night she ran? She sat on a bale of hay, hands resting calmly on her lap. There were men in the band who wanted power, she said. Men who used fear to control decisions. When I spoke against them, they said I disrespected the elders. When a fight broke out later between two families, they blamed me. I refused to lie to protect them. Her voice did not waver. So they sent me away, not because I was guilty, but because they wanted me silent. Elias leaned against a post, arms crossed. Then they were wrong, he said simply. And if they ever come here, they'll learn that. Ayoka nodded. They won't come. Exile is final. Once cast out, you no longer exist to them. Elias didn't say it, but relief eased his shoulders. She noticed. As the sun lowered, they prepared dinner together. Ayoka ground herbs with a stone bowl she found among Elias's supplies. He chopped vegetables from the small garden. The simple act of working side by side brought a quiet warmth between them. When they sat near the fire to eat, Ayoka studied Elias for a long moment. You shared your past with me, she said. All the pain you carried alone. And I shared mine. Now we have no secrets between us. No, Elias agreed. We don't. Her next words came with careful honesty. I want to build something here. Something that lasts. Elias turned his head fully toward her. His voice stayed steady, grounded. I want that too. The fire crackled softly. Ayoka reached out and placed her hand on his. Not in fear, not in desperation, but in choice. His fingers closed around hers gently, as though accepting a new chapter he'd never imagined himself ready for. The final question that needed clarity was, would Elias and Ayoka build a future together or part ways once fear no longer bound them? That question ended here. When night came, Ayoka lay her blanket beside Elias's bedroll without needing to ask. He settled beside her, close but not crowding. She rested her head on his shoulder, her breath calm and even. For the first time, she did not wake during the night, not once. Elias slept deeply too, the weight of years lifting from him at last. By dawn, the ranch felt less like a refuge for two wounded souls and more like the beginning of a shared life. Ayoka stepped outside and looked over the land as sunlight began to spill across the fields. This is home now, she said. Elias stepped beside her, hands resting loosely at his sides. Yes, he answered, for both of us. There were no more questions left between them. No unresolved fears. No unfinished business. Their lives, once shaped by loss, exile, and fear, now pointed toward the same horizon. Chapter 9 closed with a grounded, peaceful truth. Elias and Ayoka stayed, not because they needed each other to survive, but because they chose each other to live.